During 1988, as Star Trek The Next Generation entered the production of its second season, across town another production was taking shape. The movie Short Circuit 2 was also in production, and through a series of mishaps and malicious intentions, the great science fiction war of 1988 had begun. I bring you a timeline of the activities that made up this heated battle, facts discovered through a combination of rumours and now deleted reports. Sit back and enjoy the history of the great science fiction war of 1988. Now, there were several wars in 1988, but none of them were quite as big as the war of science fiction that was fought in the USA in 1988. The war of Star Trek and Short Circuit 2 would keep both franchises in the headlines for several months, as these two Goliaths of the silver screen would go head-to-head with actors from both productions bad-mouthing the other with little provocation. For example, one Star Trek actor would claim that Short Circuit 2 was as stupid as a pile of fish, whereas a Short Circuit 2 actor, Theobald Ruggo, claimed that Star Trek Next Generation was nothing but dirt on the shoe of a dead homeless slug collector. As TriStar Pictures hadn't been neutered yet by its acquisition by Sony in 1989, the company's big hit for 1988, Short Circuit 2, continued its ongoing vendetta with Star Trek. Actor James Crossley from Short Circuit 2 visited Studio 9 at Paramount after lying that he was friends with one of the cruciate actors working on Star Trek. Once he was inside, he sabotaged some of the lighting on the bridge and tried to sow seeds of discontent between the crew of the Enterprise. He told Worf actor Michael Dorn that Marina Sirtis called him a big slug, and told Lever Burton that Whoopi Goldberg had spat on his back when he wasn't looking. Luckily, new cast member Dr. Pulaski had been keeping an eye out on this stranger on the set, and she'd seen that trouble was being caused. She'd had enough of this and grasped James Crossley by the shirt, telling him to get out now before things turned ugly. It didn't take long before she found out exactly who the man was and set about exacting revenge on the actors of Short Circuit 2, elevating the war between Star Trek and Short Circuit 2 to newer and more violent heights. She was possibly heard claiming that Short Circuit has a stupid robot, but Star Trek has a much better robot in the character of Data. In this very episode, Dr. Pulaski goes out of her way to tell the audience that Data is alive, just like Johnny Five is supposedly alive in Short Circuit. The difference, of course, is that Data looks like a humanoid, whereas Johnny Five looks like a pile of old toilet rolls. It was during the production of Elementary Dear Data that the feud between Star Trek and its sci-fi rival of 1988 really picked up pace. In the first take of Data being in the holodeck, a scuffle was happening to the stage left as actors from Short Circuit 2 had made their way to the Star Trek Studio 9 set with nothing on their mind but causing trouble. They upended the catering table and even threw some of the episode's period costumes onto the custard and cakes that they tipped onto the floor. Worf actor Michael Dorn and his cousin had to restrain the Short Circuit 2 actors and forcefully eject them from the Paramount studios. Here is footage of the original first take. Listen carefully and you'll hear subtle manifestations of trouble. Around the time of producing The Outrageous O'Connor, things were heating up between Star Trek and its science fiction rival, Short Circuit 2. In an interview on News Today, Short Circuit's Fisher Stevens ate a banana during an interview, laughing, obviously mocking Patrick Stewart's love for bananas. Fisher would go on to compare the actors from Star Trek to the actors in Short Circuit, admitting that the Star Trek actors were more satisfied in their work than the Short Circuit actors.
No, it seems to me that there's not as much, they don't mess around as much. they're satisfied.
He would add that the Star Trek actors were more satisfied because they weren't trying very hard anymore, whereas the Short Circuit actors were always striving to be better. He even specifically mentioned Data is particularly lazy and boring, whereas Johnny Five from Short Circuit is full of exciting energy. Now, it was around this time that the famous war between Star Trek and its science fiction rival, Short Circuit 2, was really heating up. During filming of some of Short Circuit 2's early scenes, the actors were seen mocking the crew of the Enterprise, as seen in the outtakes on the Short Circuit 2 DVD. Actor Fisher Stevens is seen putting hands on top of his head, making him look bald, while shouting, "Make it so," at his co-actor. The other actor in the scene is seen laughing at Fisher and responds, "Beam me up." Allegedly, after the cameras went off here, Fisher told his co-actor that he should rub a lump of shit on his forehead to make him look like a Klingon. At the American Science Fiction Awards 1988, the award for Best Robot of the Year was hotly contested, with the Star Trek robot Data representing Star Trek, and Johnny Five from Short Circuit 2 representing Short Circuit 2. Both of these popular robots made it as finalists, but both lost out to the eventual winner, Crichton from Red Dwarf. Whereas Star Trek bowed out gracefully, producers from Short Circuit 2 threw their drinks to the ground and claimed that the awards were an absolute scam. They rasped that the hydraulics on Johnny Five's special arms were more interesting alone than Data and Crichton together. It's this showing of sore loserness that would cause the war between Star Trek and Short Circuit 2 to heat up in the near future. Whilst living in the wilderness in the summer, Jonathan Frakes' neighbour was a young Fisher Stevens, the actor from hits such as 1981's The Burning and 1986's Short Circuit. As the only other person for miles, Frakes possibly wrote in his memoirs that he and Stevens bonded over a mutual love of hunting and prospecting, although Frakes noted that Fisher Stevens ironically hated fishing. It was this friendship that Fisher Stevens had for Jonathan Frakes that he would use as a stepping stone to heat up the great sci-fi war of 1988. Star Trek's science fiction rival in 1988, Short Circuit 2, might have been short of circuits, but they weren't short on ideas of how to anger their Star Trek rivals over at Paramount. Fisher Stevens would allegedly send his friend Jonathan Frakes packages to be delivered to Studio 9. To start off, the hateful messages in the mail were shrugged off as jokes by Frakes, but when his co-stars saw the awful things that Stevens and his Short Circuit 2 co-stars were saying, they were sickened to the core, and revenge was assured. One note delivered to the Paramount crew from the Short Circuit 2 team suggested that Geordie LaForge should stay blind so that he can't see how stupid Star Trek is. Another note mocked Wesley Crusher's gorgeous rainbow sweater that he wore in Series 1, calling Crusher an unlovable freak.
I am Ensign Menda. I just wanted to tell you how pleased I am to be aboard the Enterprise.
Yes, of course.
In a recent interview with Better Call Saul's actor Michael McKean, he reflected on his time on the show and how it was one of his favourite filming experiences, but also reflected back to his time on working on Star Trek Next Generation's science fiction rival in 1988, Short Circuit 2. In a shocking story that he possibly shared, he noted that during the production of Short Circuit 2's fight scenes, he would be told by the director to imagine that he was actually punching the face of Star Trek characters and not just nameless goons, to give him an extra sense of hatred and impetus. Shortly after these fight scenes, he maybe claims that he was seeing LeVar Burton at a charity soiree, and the first thing that came into his mind was to attack him with his fists, as if he was a nameless goon to be terminated. Michael McKean went as far as to tell Burton to stay away from him unless he wanted two black eyes. This was only the start of the feud between the two productions though, as from this point the war of 1988 was really starting to heat up. Star Trek's science fiction rival Short Circuit 2 was halfway through its production, and Rick Berman caught wind of what had been happening between Star Trek and Short Circuit 2. As a wild form of retaliation, Rick called the cinema owner of his hometown in Burkeville, Arizona, and told him that if he shows any Short Circuit films at the cinemas, then Rick would block them from ever having any future Star Trek movies distributed there. So the owner of Boca View Picture Houses owned both of the movie theatres in the town, and so Rick gained a measurable victory over Short Circuit 2. There was no way that any Short Circuit films would be making any money in that town. Rumour has it that he even called a meeting with the Star Trek actors to brag about his manoeuvre, and he was happy to finally be considered as one of the boys. In retaliation to the aggressive moves that Short Circuit 2's producers were making, Star Trek actor Lever Burton visited the set of Short Circuit 2 with a peace offering. He brought a selection of cheeses and crackers for the actors and production staff and apologised to Fisher Stevens for their recent falling out. But his trip there possibly held an alternative motive. While no one was looking, he snuck into the technical studio and pulled off Johnny Five's arm at the elbow, hiding it in his special backpack. Production on Short Circuit 2 ground to a halt for 5 days, while they quickly had to make a new arm for Johnny Five. At a victory party at the Star Trek studio, Burton's cousin, Tim, suggested that they wait until the heat dies down from the theft, and then use the broken arm as a prop in a future Star Trek production. 7 years later, while directing, Jonathan Frakes would use the arm in Star Trek Voyager Season 2 episode Prototype. Star Trek's rival at the time, Short Circuit 2, had been firing shots at Star Trek, from slurs to bordering on violence. It was around this time that the novelization of Short Circuit 2 hit the bookshelves of North America. One part of the book that sprung to the attention of Star Trek fans was the use of the backronym TNG in the Short Circuit 2 book. The use of TNG meant Transient Neutered Gump, which is what the bad guys referred to the homeless as. Also in the book, but missing from the film, was a character called Dr. Crusher, who was a terrible doctor who did everything wrong. As bad as that sounds, things were only just beginning in the great science fiction war of 1988. Part 2 will be coming soon, which really steps up the war between Star Trek and Short Circuit 2. You can't miss these terrific facts.